Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I hope you can hear me clearly. You'll have to excuse me, I'm a bit tired today because I spent 5 hours driving to Victoria and back yesterday. But the upshot of that is that we got a very good interview with someone called Lama Rodney from Canada, and he was doing an interview or explaining his experience with the controversial figure Chogyam Trungpa in the late 60s and 70s at Samiling. And this interview will be posted on Spotify probably next week, once I've just edited out some of the noise, etc. So please look out for that interview on Spotify. Also, next week on Sunday there won't be any meditation class because I have to take my father for an MRI at the local hospital. So there will be this week we'll have a meditation course, but next week it will be cancelled. I guess that's the 12th of April. And also bear in mind that at the end of the month we have a 1-week silent retreat, and that means on May the 3rd there will be no monthly question and answer live stream, and on May the 4th there will be no meditation class, although we might broadcast something live from the retreat possibly on the 4th to substitute. Excuse me. So thank you for all your questions. I'm trying to go as fast as I can, but we have quite a complex question, or a couple of complex questions today. It will take a bit of time. Clinton sort of interjected a question, so he's jumped ahead of the queue, but because it's related to our recent meditation on the elements of the body, I thought I should address it here. As you know, then last week we looked at the 4 or 5 elements that constitute the body in terms of the earth element, earth, water, fire, wind. But also in the Mahayana we look at the space element, the cavities in the body, the cavities in the nasal passage, etc. So he found that very helpful, meditating on the elements of the body, and had some kind of understanding or experience of how the body is merely made up of the 5 aggregates, and which are the psychosomatic kind of continuum of form and mental events. Now, the way he phrased it feels kind of like he was saying he has some kind of realization of that. Actually, realization of this is quite difficult, but we can get a basic understanding through these meditations. For example, sitting in meditation, scanning through the body, looking at the form of the body, the constituent parts, the substances the body are made of. And we kind of disassociate from identifying with the body as something solid. So within that, then in his mind, in Clinton's mind, a paradox arose. And that's because it teaches that there is no self other than that which is imputed upon the 5 aggregates. Forms, feelings, perceptions, discrimination, these sorts of things, right? So forms and feelings, discriminations and formations, consciousness. And however, through meditation, and he's had this kind of personal insight of this experience of peace and tranquility, or equanimity, some people call it feeling of infinity that arises through meditation. And it gives us a hint of what it is like to achieve awakening or liberation. And most people have had insights into this, or glimpses of this tranquility of mind, this sense of peace. And so, from his perspective, it seems as if what is being taught is that there are these aggregates, physical form, mental events, and then we associate that with a self, but in reality there is no self other than that, So then he's asking, well, what is this kind of experience of peace and equanimity, this experience of clarity, etc., that one experiences? And isn't this basically a contradiction? So this is quite a deep question. It's a very good question. Now, what we need to look at is the way that awakening is described by the Buddha, right? So we have this mistaken sense of a self that we mistakenly adhere to, the form and mental events that we have, and then liberation, as it's taught, or nirvana, is where we eliminate that misassociation. So the term nirvana means blowing out or snuffing out. When you have a candle, you blow it out, that's nirvana. And some people attribute this to the eradication of the sense of self. Likewise, in the scriptures, it's taught to be an eradication of desire, for example. Desire causes us to be reborn in samsara. And then Clinton further goes on to ask, he says, well, so we've got this feeling of peace, tranquility, openness, whatever you want to call it. And then he says, is that why the Mahayana philosophers invented the concept of Buddha nature? So it kind of implies that the philosophers were sitting there thinking, we need something else here. Let's invent Buddha nature. Of course, they won't agree with that, right? Because there is what we call the Uttara Tantra Shastra, the highest continuum. It's one of the books on the suggested reading list on the website. And there's a huge amount of text in the Mahayana scriptures that talks about the Buddha nature. And there it's claimed that these were actual teachings of the Buddha, teachings associated with the Mahayana Sutras. And of course, these aren't accepted within the Theravadan tradition. So here we come to the first point of contention. Is this Buddha nature something that was invented that wasn't present at the time of the Buddha? Or is it something that was taught by the Buddha? Now, we have to look at the difference between how the Buddha's own description of enlightenment is, how it compares between the Pali Canon and what we call the Mahayana Sutras. And famously in the Lalita Vistara Sutra, then the Buddha says, I've discovered a profound and peace free from elaboration, luminous clarity, and uncompounded. I have found a nectar-like Dharma, yet if I were to teach it, no one would understand, so I shall remain silent here in the forest. Now, this is what's described in the Mahayana Sutras. It's generally accepted by all Mahayana Buddhists. And you have to understand that the majority of Buddhists are Mahayana Buddhists. There's 300 million alone in China, and they're Mahayana Buddhists. So actually they outnumber the Theravadins by quite a lot. But this sutra is not accepted in the Pali Canon. So is this something that was kind of added on later? Now this description, profound and peaceful, unelaborate, luminosity, etc., conforms very closely to what we call the realization of the Buddha nature or Mahamudra or Dzogchen. So it fits very nicely into that. Let's compare that to what we have in the Pali Canon. And there, the words that the Buddha declared upon enlightenment was that ignorance was destroyed, knowledge arose. Darkness was destroyed, light arose, as happens in one who is heedful, ardent, and resolute. So that heedful, ardent, and resolute is how we describe the Buddha, someone who applies themselves to practice with diligence and resolve, and then achieves enlightenment. Now, the problem here, the basis of the paradox, in terms of Clinton's position, is that it is an assumption, or it's assuming a nihilistic view. So it's assuming that there is nothing, right? We have this experience of forms, feelings, perceptions, etc., formations, consciousness, and we think that's a self, we get rid of that, and then there is nothing else. right? Which kind of fits the idea of what we talk about nirvana, like being a snuffing out, a removal. But in the Pali Canon, it says, ignorance was destroyed, knowledge arose. So knowledge is not a statement of nothingness, right? It's not a nihilistic statement. And darkness was destroyed, light arose. Again, light is an implication of something and not nothing. And these terms itself, knowledge and light, and if we look at some of the other Pali Canons, then they talk about wisdom and freedom. These terms themselves really conform very well to the Mahayana position. Because what we talk about is this synthesis, this union of wisdom and emptiness, these two aspects. So this knowing, this knowledge, and compassion. And also if we look at how the Buddha, how a Buddha acts once a Buddha becomes enlightened. And what the Buddha does is the Buddha teaches the Dharma for the benefit of beings. We can see this from the comments that the Buddha made at the time of death. Right? So before death, before parinirvana, the Buddha urged his monks to work out your salvation with care and to be a lamp unto yourselves and a refuge to others. Right? Now these two aspects are also the same in the Mahayana Dharma. And that is the achievement of the two benefits, self-benefit and benefit of other. And self-benefit is the realization of the Dharmakaya. That's to become a Buddha, right? So we call the embodiment of the ultimate truth. That is the realization that it abides in the mind of the Buddha. This is the knowledge or the wisdom the Buddha holds. The other aspect is to be a refuge for others, to help to liberate others or to encourage them onto the path so they can achieve awakening. And this is the compassion aspect. So although it's not explicit, it's implied within what appears in the Pali Canon. And it's just more explicit in the Mahayana. But the term for a fully enlightened Buddha is a great bodhisattva. Right? The Buddha, in terms of the Pali Canon, was an arhat with remainder, and once the Buddha died, passed into parinirvana, then the Buddha became an arhat without a remainder. But there's another term that's used for the Buddha, and that is the great compassionate one, or the great bodhisattva. And that just shows that the Buddha works for the benefit of beings. If this was a nihilistic view, is essentially that the Buddha, upon enlightenment, realized nothingness, then there would be no beings to work for. There would be no activity for beings. There wouldn't be these things called the two benefits. That is, to be a lamp unto yourself and a refuge for others. And this lamp unto yourself is the realization of wisdom. So we can see there that fundamentally, aside from the way it's described, then fundamentally these two are not contradictory. So we have to return to Clinton's question because it's quite difficult. So he says that through this meditation of looking at the elements of the body, there's a strong feeling of how we're just imputing this self upon the body, and so when we achieve enlightenment, what's left? And then also the other aspect of that is that from time to time, through his practice throughout the years, then he's had these experiences. Right? They may be fleeting or some ephemeral experiences, these experiences of peace, tranquility, and equanimity. So he says, what the hell is this? What is this thing? This other thing, this experience of this peace and tranquility, right? So, what the hell is it in terms of what constitutes our being? Yeah. As if there's this element, this other element, or essence, that constitutes our being that is not dependent upon form, like outer experience of form and inner experience of mental events. Now, he suggests that this is what was invented within the Mahayana as described by Buddha nature. But that there is a basic contradiction here. Yeah? The idea of Buddha nature as an essence mixed with these ideas of dependent ordination and emptiness creates a paradox. Now, I have to say that he's using mixed metaphors here, because the aspect of dependent or origination, we talk about the 12 links of interdependence, right? This starts with ignorance, and then existence comes from these 3 links of thirst, appropriation, and existence. That's where suffering comes from. So when we look at the Pali Canon, when they're talking about liberation, they say that this thirst or craving, Trishna is the term, Trishna literally means thirst. From thirst or craving, then we have upadana. Upadana is to pick or appropriate, right? It's the term used to pick flowers. You see a beautiful flower and you pick it. So first we have this craving, and then we have this, we appropriate something, and because of that we're born in the world. And what they do is they eliminate this desire or thirst or craving, and because of that they are no longer reborn. And so the 12 links of interdependence are reversed, it says, or you could say, or ceased, and then we experience liberation, which is a cessation. And it sounds like that's the end. There's nothing there. And in the Mahayana, what they say is, well, if you look at these 3 links of the 12 links of interdependence, yes, this will mean you are no longer born in samsara, but the first link is ignorance. And ignorance is this notion of me and mine, self and others. Basic fundamental notion of duality, but that is based on the idea of a self. So in the Mahayana, we say, yes, you have to get rid of desire, but the root of desire is ignorance. And so when they reverse the 12 links of interdependence, they go right back to ignorance. Right? Okay, so we've got this paradox. And then he says the idea of dependent origination and emptiness. Well, emptiness is a Mahayana view. You have to understand that. Right? So you can't really lump in the idea of the Pali view of the reversal of the 12 links of interdependence with emptiness. Because emptiness is not a view of nothingness. It's not a nihilistic view. In fact, emptiness can only exist with the appearing aspect. So compassion and emptiness, or appearance and emptiness, bliss and emptiness, however you want to describe it. It is, it's not merely a view of nothingness. So we'd have to take that out of the equation. So he's saying that the notion of the Buddha nature as being essential nature of being, and this idea that there is nothing other than the 5 aggregates and the 6 senses in terms of being, are at odds with each other. So we come to another 2 problems here. One is the idea that the Buddha nature is the essence of being. And there's a huge amount of debate, and I've talked about this before. We have the term Tathagata Garbha, right? So it's Buddha nature. Tathagata, the term for a Buddha, right? The one who has realized suchness. And Garbha means essence. And this term Garbha, because of the Sanskrit grammar, can be interpreted in 2 ways. It can either mean like a container, like a womb, right? Or like the analogy is inside of a lotus flower, there is a fully formed Buddha statue in the middle. So it can mean that, like a container of a Tathagata, like a womb, and inside the womb there's a Tathagata fully formed. Or it can mean essence. And most Mahayanists, it's difficult, but let's say most, believe that this Buddha nature is kind of fully formed. I mean, there's 2 schools. One where that needs to be developed, and one where it is fully developed, but it needs to be revealed. For many, then Buddha nature is something that's already there, that needs to be revealed. But there is a contradiction here in terms of his question, this idea of Buddha nature as an essence, and what we call the meaning of emptiness. Because the meaning of emptiness really means that things lack essential essence. So, as I answer this question, it only gets more complicated, right? So what he's saying is, okay, if there is this paradox, that's fine with me, because I believe that we need to have faith beyond the bounds of logic. So it's okay for me. But he wants to know if there are kind of answers, and he says specifically, are there logical answers to this paradox in the Mahayana and the Vajrayana? So now we come to this other term, being. And this is a very problematic term in Buddha Dharma. As we know, then there is the statement that the view of the Buddha Dharma is the middle way. And I've made previous videos on this topic, and I've explained it in as much as there are three types of middle way. There's the middle way of view, conduct, and meditation. And in the Hinayana, then they talk about the middle way as being the middle way of conduct. So that is not falling to the extreme of, these extreme yogic practices and self-denial, self-mortification, and not falling to the extreme of opulence or luxury. But in the Mahayana, when we talk about the middle way, it's the middle way between the extremes of a belief in existence and non-existence. And being has very much to do with this notion of existence. So the question is there a logical explanation as posited by the Mahayana or the Vajrayana? And as I've said before, on this complicated topic, then there are three levels of view associated with the three vehicles: the Theravada, Mahayana, and the Vajrayana. Right? The foundational vehicle, the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, and the final turning of the wheel of Dharma. So in terms of the middle turning of the wheel, the view of Zen practitioners, Chinese Mahayanists, Vietnam Mahayanists, etc., then it was not a teaching of the four truths, but a teaching of the two truths. The four truths being the truth of suffering, the causes and results of suffering, how we get to suffer and what causes that, and the causes and results of liberation, what causes liberation, and what the path is that leads to liberation, the Noble Eightfold Path. So what is taught is that when a Buddha becomes enlightened, that Buddha realizes these four noble truths. And that is the wisdom that rises to mind, and they teach that to others. Right? In the Mahayana, the answer in the Mahayana is that we have the two truths. That is the provisional truth and the ultimate truth. So there is this ultimate truth of reality, which, as Clinton suggests, is beyond conceptual imputation. It's samyula-depa in Tibetan, which means beyond the bounds of the realm of cognition, you could say. And there's the provisional truth. And the provisional truth is the way that we see things on conventional terms that is mistaken. In conventional terms, we can talk about things like arising and ceasing, abiding, but ultimately these things do not exist. And what we have is this stainless Buddha nature, or the synthesis of appearance emptiness. Again, as I said earlier, and really this position of appearance emptiness isn't different to what is being taught in the Pali Canon when they talk about freedom and wisdom. Right? Freedom is freedom from the bounds of these conceptual binding, which causes us to experience desire and therefore suffering. And wisdom is this knowledge or this intelligence that the Buddha is taught to possess. Right? Again, so it's not a nihilistic view. It's not like there is nothing. Right? In the Vajrayana, they teach this one single truth, and that is the truth of liberation. And you could say this is the Mahamudra, the Dzogchen. It's the truth of clarity or the truth of luminosity. Yeah, but it's not a light. But let's look at the problem in a kind of more conventional way. And in a conventional terms, you have to ask yourself, what is the one statement, valid statement, you can make about existence? About whatever it is we experience, right? Some Western philosophers would say, I think, therefore I am. I think this was Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am. And also in the Hindu tradition, they talk about I am. I am is like the fundamental principle. That is problematic in Buddhism, because that implies definitive existence, right? Fixed identity. If you talk about being, then you have to describe what is meant by being, for something to substantially exist. And in terms of Nagarjuna, the Nagarjuna explains existence, if something truly exists, right, then it has to have a kind of three qualities. It has to be singular, independent, and permanent, unchanging. Otherwise, that thing is ephemeral. Now, that in itself is a very deep topic. So in order to have some substantial existence, it has to have those qualities. And when we look at what is meant by I am in the Vedic tradition, then it follows that kind of definition, right? Because they talk about it as being infinite, pure, permanent, singular, indivisible, those sorts of things. So they don't disagree. But what is said in the Buddha Dharma is that this notion of absolute being is mistaken, or absolute identity, right? This third turning of the wheel of Dharma, the Vajrayana view, is described as signlessness, lack of characteristics, lack of definitive identity. Now, this position is very compatible with the modern understanding of quantum physics. We understand that what makes up all observable phenomena are these kind of particles that exist in superposition. It just gets more and more complicated, right? Sorry. But if you ask me complicated questions, and I have to give you deep answers, and those deep answers are difficult, you have to think about this a lot. Right? We know that we can conventionally, right, in terms of the second turn of the wheel of Dharma and provisional truth, we say that's a hand, right? We all accept that is a hand, right? Is that a hand? Yes, that's a hand. Nobody's going to disagree. But then when I ask you what is a hand, it becomes difficult, right? Saying, is the hand the sum of the component parts? And somebody will say, oh yeah, of course it is. Yeah, you've got fingers and a thumb. And if I say, okay, well, if I get rid of my thumb, or chop off my thumb, do I still have a hand? People say, yes, you still have a hand. Right? And you can say, is it the things it's made of, like the substances? Is it the flesh and the bones, etc.? And what we find is that this notion of hand is conventional. So in the classical world, everybody kind of understands that. The difference is, in the modern era, since the invention of quantum physics, what we've come to understand is the very particles that make up this hand themselves exist in superposition. So we can think of it this way. Let's say you've got a little particle that spins to the left. So there's no such thing as a left spinning particle. That particle spins to the left, it spins to the right, and it spins to the left and right both at the same time. To that is just inconceivable. But physics, they're pretty clear on this, right? Niels Bohr was no idiot, right? He was a profoundly intelligent scientist. And we're not going to argue with these kind of people, right? They know a hell of a lot more than we do. And they can prove it, not only with mathematics, but through experimentation. And they can make incredibly accurate predictions based on this theory and knowledge. So it's like, we haven't got a chance to argue with these people. And this is really compatible with the answer in the Vajrayana. Okay, so the answer, I think, therefore I am. Or things exist. Well, I can only say that things exist. This doesn't cut it, because we have to ask what is existence, right? So again, the question is, what is the one thing we can say about reality, right? We can't really definitively talk about the nature of reality. Even scientists can't do that. They don't even know what light is, right? So what is light? And they will say, well, we theorize it as a wavicle. What's a wavicle? Oh, it's a particle and a wave at the same time. We really don't know what it is. We can't say anything definitive. What we can say is that stuff appears. Can anybody deny that? Right? The fact that stuff appears refutes a nihilistic view. This is very important. I mean, why am I talking about all this science and all this stuff? Because it goes right back to the very basis of Clinton's question. Yes, we impute the notion of a self upon the aggregates, form, and the mental experiences, right? But we cannot deny that things appear. And this is very much the foundation of the answer in terms of both the Mahayana and the Vajrayana. The difference is that in the Mahayana, there's this implication that there is something ultimately existent, and that conventionally we have these imputations. In general, they follow this thing called the three natures in Mahayana Buddhism, in the Zen tradition. That's a way of analyzing reality, right? So we've got this other dependent nature, thoroughly imputed nature, and ultimate reality. And they talk in this way. And the thoroughly imputed nature is the non-existent one. And what does exist, again in the Zen tradition, is the other dependent nature and the truly existent nature. And the other dependent nature is what we call provisional reality. And the ultimate nature is the Buddha nature, or whatever you want to call it, enlightenment. Now, in the Vajrayana, they do not adhere to any definitive identification. But at the same time, do not refute appearances. This is the important thing. So this thing we talk about, the question that Clinton is asking, well, they say there's no self other than what we impute upon the five aggregates, right? So it's an illusory thing. It's thoroughly imputed nature, something we just make up. But at the same time, when I meditate, from time to time, I have this experience of clarity, bliss, emptiness. I have the experience of peace and equanimity, etc., etc. So what is this other thing, right? And this is what they call the Buddha nature. In the Vajrayana, this is called the Dharmakaya. It's also called the Dharmakaya in the Mahayana. What is the definition of the Dharmakaya? The definition of the Dharmakaya is the present moment of awareness free of clinging. Clinging, you can say, or you can say identification. Now, this is something that we can directly refer to and relate to, because every sentient being has the experience of subjective awareness. And if you deny the existence of subjective awareness, then you're a nihilist, right? If you sit there, right, if I turn on lots of flashing lights, disco lights, and I say, do you see anything? And you go, no, I don't see anything, right? You're just kidding yourself on. People do that when they meditate. I ask this of people sometimes when I'm giving instructions. And I'll say, do you experience anything? Have you seen anything? And they say, no, there is only mind, or something like that. Or everything is emptiness, right? What my teacher did when somebody said this, my own teacher, Khenpo Labu, one of his students had said this, he says, what is it you experience? I experience nothing. And then Khenpo Labu went, thwack, and hit him on the head. You can't get away with this in the West, right? Don't do this in the West. But you can do it in there, because they're like Asians, right? They get the point. And he was just, oh, my head. He got the point immediately, right? We have experience. Do not deny this. If you do, you're a fool. This is what the non-dual zombies do, right? They hear some really, like, everything is empty, and nothing exists, there is no separation. There's no separation from the mala in my head. And then, then what are you worried about, right? Will you jump out of the way if a car comes rushing down the street? I've asked this question before. Of course we do. So this is fundamental. Things appear. We know that. But then I say to you, in what way do they appear? Are they real? Then it becomes difficult. So part of our problem is that we need to start from the basics. And the Buddha very much started from the basics. The questions about ultimate reality are the ones that are addressed in personal one-to-one instruction with your Zen master. And they do this over a period of decades, right? They'll meditate on Zazen for 12 years. And then when the Zen master sees a student might have some potential, or the student seeks out the Zen master, they will start to ask them difficult questions. But only if they think they've already done some groundwork. And this is where we start thinking about ultimate nature of reality. Because it's complicated, right? But if we start off, usually what we do is we start off with some really, they sound quite profound questions, but it's loaded. We've got basically 100 different doubts and questions in one question. But we haven't resolved the very basics, the ABCs. And what the Buddha taught first was the Four Noble Truths. And the first amongst these Four Noble Truths are, is there suffering? And when I say suffering, it's like, are there things that we can't accept? Unacceptable. And once we've kind of become certain about that, yeah, well, actually, it's not like everything is bliss, right? We don't start off with there's no good or bad, there is only purity. That's the view of the Vajrayana. We start off with, yeah, actually, I could improve things in my life. I've got problems. Sometimes I don't sleep at night because of anxiety. I remember trauma. When somebody at work insults me, it hurts me. When my girlfriend left me, then I was crying for a month. Right? We all know this. Again, it's undeniable. Things appear, and also we're not 100% happy. This awakening, what the Buddha taught, is this total peace, right? Total freedom from experience. But when the Buddha became enlightened, then it wasn't a nihilistic view, because if it was, then why would the Buddha then teach others? By following this path, progressing in this way, then eventually what we do is we get closer and closer to the ultimate truth. And this process evolves over time. So this is related to a question, I don't think I'll go on more about this, because basically any one of these elements that was raised in this question, I could go on for hours on each one. But let's just think about it in terms of this next question. It's from somebody from Anu World Order, from an unknown country. Maybe the lamas could please speak about the Eightfold Noble Path. So it's a Noble Eightfold Path, right? And this is a progression. And in terms of what I was just discussing, you have to understand that the very start is right view. Right? So you go through this progression, but it's sequential. And we have this right view. And you'll remember in my previous videos, I've told you, there's any spiritual tradition, doesn't matter what it is, Hindu, Christian, then there's three things. There's view, conduct, and meditation. And you start off with view. And the culmination on the 8th part of that journey is samadhi, or meditation. It's like resting in that view. But what you have to understand is, depending on the level of the view, we've got the Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, then this is cyclical. So you start off with this basic view of the Four Noble Truths, and then you end up, the culmination, which is the samadhi, or the meditation, that will lead to being born as an arahat. But then that view evolves, and you start that path again in the Mahayana, and then again in the Vajrayana. So it's cyclical, until eventually you achieve final awakening. The point is that the bare minimum is to seek liberation from the mundane world. But in that process of seeking liberation from the mundane world, then there are intermediary stages, and one of them is just to achieve better rebirths. So you have better potential for practice, right? Like if you're in hell, and there's plenty of places on earth that are like hell. For example, if you're in Gaza having bombs dropped on your head and you're just running here and there with no food or water, you don't really have the opportunity to practice the Dharma, right? It's just like being in hell. And so an interim stage on this path is just to achieve better rebirths by applying oneself to virtue in this life. So as I said, in the Eightfold Noble Path, then the first stage is right view. And in terms of the original Pali Canon, then that's like the view that there is something after death. Right? When you die, it's not over. And this is taught to be what is called the highest worldly view. So the first is rebirth, and then the next is that actions have consequences. So it's a basic belief that death is not the end, and also that there are consequences to our actions. And that's kind of like the baseline of the view. And in terms of this, then the Buddha taught these systems of different worlds where you can be reborn, etc. So essentially, once you have this view of cyclic existence and that there is something called causality, then based on that, you can make the next step. which is to resolve. Is your resolve. What am I going to do? First, you have to understand what the right view is, right? So let's say we have this worldly view, modern worldly view, that everything is random, right? The universe just started by random with the Big Bang, and there's no meaning to anything, right? Depending on that view, then there's various different types of conduct you can decide to engage in. For example, if you have a very nihilistic view, it's a bit like, well, it doesn't matter what I do, you know. Like if I just take loads of drugs and waste my life, become a junkie, it doesn't make any difference. I'm going to die. And many people have this kind of nihilistic view these days because they don't believe in causality and they don't believe in rebirth. So this life is the only one. And so for a lot of people, this means that they follow what is essentially a hedonistic path. This is what the Charvakas did, right? We've got this hedonist sect in Buddhism, not in Buddhism, in this Indian subcontinent. And this is very much the view that a lot of Osho followers have. It's just like, you know, there is no karma, cause and effect, there is no Buddha, there is no this or that, let's just have fun, you know? And many people are hedonists. It's a very popular view because it's like, well, it doesn't matter, I'm going to die, so what do I got to do? And for some people, it's like, well, you got to make money so you're comfortable. For other people, it's even like, well, even that's a waste of time, you just got to live for today. So, in terms of the Buddhist path at least, then you have this belief that this is not it. This is not the only thing. And also what I do matters. And so then you get the second one, right? Right resolve, or right thought, right aspiration, right motivation. And then on a very kind of basic level, I suppose, in the Pali, then that would be, okay, I'm going to conduct myself with non-harm, ahimsa. This is also similar in the yoga tradition, right? This non-violent act, because violence causes future suffering for me and others. And also then the Buddhist monks, initially what they would do is they would develop renunciation. So it is to go from the home to homelessness. And they live in this way to remove desire. But you can also develop the resolve to become liberated. And in the Mahayana, this resolve is a little bit different because it's the resolve not just to become liberated for one's own benefit, but to become a Buddha for the sake of all other sentient beings. So it's slightly different. In the Mahayana, it's this resolve to achieve the two benefits. Self-benefit, which is the realization of the Dharmakaya, and other benefit, which is the Rupakaya, the Formkaya. So first you have right view, and you think, wow, this is not the only thing, and not only that, actions matter. And then at a very baseline, you think, well, I better behave myself, better not cause harm, and I also should cut myself off from all these sources of giving rise to attachment and desire. And if you're a Mahayanist, then you think, well, I need to become a Buddha. And then based on that, the next stages come. Right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, etc. Right? So these wrong speech has consequences. Killing, stealing have consequences. Right? So you have a view, you have resolve, like, okay, now I've got a goal. I've got to end this suffering, at least, in this world, or achieve liberation. And so I'd better guard my speech, guard my conduct, and also have the right kind of livelihood, right? So if I'm, in the classical world, then blacksmiths would make swords, right? So if I'm somebody in the arms manufacturing industry, or if I work in an abattoir, or if I sort of make fentanyl, something like that, and I become a Buddhist, I think, wow, actions have consequences. And this isn't the only life. The reason why I'm suffering now is because of the negative things I did in the past. And well, I better behave myself, and I should try to live a good life. So what do I have to do? Okay, I've got to not lie, right? I've got to not kill. And I've got to think about what I'm going to do for a living, because I've got to, survive. Ultimately, the monks and nuns, then they go off into a community and they avoid all mundane activity, but not all of us can do that. So provisionally, then we have to at least start by giving up negative acts, right? Like stealing from people. If you work for the organized crime, you've a gang or something, then you're going to leave that. In fact, we have people in the monastery who used to be gang members in Nepal, And then they met the Bodhidharma, they thought about it and think, oh, it's so true. And like the driver, this guy, Ram, Uncle Ram we call him, he's really great. But he used to be a real heavily feared gangster in Nepal. Like all the gangs are really afraid of him still. When they see him, they think, whoa, there's Ram, he's got a reputation. He gave all that up and he started like driving and doing shopping and stuff for the monastery to create positive karma. And then after you've got those sorted out, your conduct, your livelihood, then you've got right effort, right? And right effort includes all kinds of things like the 7 factors of awakening, the things that you apply yourself to, including the practices of restraining the sense faculties, right? So your sense faculties don't go outwards towards objects of desire. And then consequently after that, then we develop right mindfulness. Now, mindfulness is really important. At this stage, if you don't have mindfulness, then there is no way. You may reduce, let's say, just from acting in non-harm, not lying. What you do is you reduce the causes of creating negative karma, so reducing future suffering. But in order to become awakened, if that is your goal, right? If your goal is just to have a better life next time around, then you can just give in charity, you can avoid killing, you can, instead of working in an abattoir, you can work for a charity, and then sort of lifetime after lifetime you'll have good conditions. You'll be born as a human with wealth and good entourage and all that sort of thing. But if you want to achieve awakening, you have to develop insight, right? You have to develop higher knowledge, right? It's not just about restraining negativity. Remember, the Buddha said, avoid all negativity, thoroughly apply yourself to virtue, and thoroughly tame the mind, right? So when it comes to this level, the 7th part of this path, then you need mindfulness. And the mindfulness is said to be like a watchman, right? Watches over, always mindful of what you're doing. Because if you don't have this, then there is no way for you to apply yourself. I mean, famously, there was that story about a monk. So there was this monk, a good kind of monk in the community, and there was a local village woman, and when the monk went out to beg, and the village woman kind of fell in love with this monk. Some people say it was a witch or something like that, but anyway. And so she wanted, some people say, so some people say that she was like a witch, and she wanted to cause this monk to give up his vows or break his vows. And she said, well, if you don't break your vows, then I'll kill myself. You know, you have to break one of them. And the monk thought, well, you know, killing wouldn't be good, and stealing wouldn't be good, and if I marry this woman and we have sexual relationships, that wouldn't be good. So what I'll do is I'll drink some alcohol, the monk said. And so he thought that's probably the least harmful, and then I'll save this woman. So he drank some alcohol, he got drunk, and then he went and broke all the other vows because he got so drunk he didn't know what he was doing. So the point here is that you have to have mindfulness. Because if you don't apply yourself to mindfulness, then you'll have no control over your actions, and you won't be able to do the final stage, the most important stage, which is this right meditation, which is what we use to develop qualities and also to realize insight. But again, as I said, if you start off with this basic view of the Four Noble Truths, and so then, okay, I must develop renunciation, I must apply myself to virtue, and you go through this cycle, then after that, you will develop this view and this resolve to become a Buddha for the sake of other sentient beings, all other beings. So rather than just be focused on personal liberation, which is just like getting out of samsara for one's own benefit, then we realize that all other sentient beings need to do this as well. And compared to me, all other sentient beings are infinite, and I am only one. And so the ultimate goal is to save everyone. And this is the Mahayana view. And then when you develop the Mahayana view, then you have to progress through the Eightfold Noble Path, the Noble Eightfold Path, until you achieve the meditation of a Mahayana practitioner. And then, and only then, you get on the Eightfold Noble Path, which is based on the view of utter purity, which is the view of the Vajrayana. So as you see, to try to start at the eighth part of the Eightfold Noble Path as taught in the Vajrayana and ignore the previous steps, then it's not going to work. That's how people become, essentially, as I said before, non-dual zombies. Now, this Anu World Order asked a lot of other questions, and actually it's just too long for me to go into it here. So I'm going to move on to Connor Lincecombe from the United States. We still have 10 minutes. I have practiced contemplation on the nature of desire, and I became depressed because the things I found joy in appeared hollow. I have meditated to attempt to identify the source of self and become afraid, though I made no realization of emptiness. I realize the independence of my senses and thoughts from any readily identifiable or central focus of consciousness. This felt to me as though it may produce a profound dissociative psychological state from which I might find recovery difficult. I remain curious and seek to explore the mind and the Buddhist teachings, but I wish to avoid these pitfalls. I suspect these to originate from my own misunderstanding, and so I ask for your insight. So this is a really good question, and it's also directly related to what Connor was talking about, and also this idea of what it means to progress on the Eightfold Noble Path. So I have practiced contemplation upon the nature of desire, and I become depressed because the things I found joy in appear hollow. Now, this is a self-contradictory statement, right? Because if you truly realized that the sources of desire, the sense perceptions, nice tasting things, nice looking things, etc., were essentially ephemeral or hollow, it wouldn't be depressing, it would be liberating. It feels depressing, it's because, for example, if I really like chocolate, and then I think, well, like this chocolate cake, let's say, right? So a little child, and you say, is chocolate cake good? And they go, it's not good, it's great, it's very good. And you say, do you want chocolate cake? Yes. And you give them a piece of chocolate cake. To them, that's just bliss, right? They can't see any way that there's anything wrong with that, and they love it. And then if you continue to give them chocolate cake, at some point they're going to become sick. And they're going to become sick of that chocolate cake, and if they look at it, they're not going to want it anymore. They're going to lose their desire. But that child doesn't realize that ultimately this chocolate cake is not a source of happiness, right? They've just had a temporary disruption in their association with this chocolate cake because they no longer crave it at the moment, right? They've had enough. And so it's kind of like this kind of level of understanding where we hear like the things we like are hollow, and we're like, oh, I can't understand that, but I really like it. It's not, it's just we understand it, right, on a really basic level. So like we're told we can't have these things, and it makes us unhappy. And that's because we haven't gotten rid of the craving or the desire, right? So, as I said before, there are three processes that are used to eliminate the kleshas and eliminate desire. That's abandonment, transformation, and the third, associated with the Vajrayana, is recognition. Now, it's of course everybody uses a mixture of these, right? It's not purely one or another, but in general we can say the different teachings of the Buddha, they focus more on one aspect or on the other. And so the Theravadan tradition, or the sort of monastic tradition, you could say, they primarily focus on abandonment. And that means to cut off the sources for giving rise to desire and then becoming habituated to that. But they also use this path of transformation. And transformation is very much about looking logically at something, right? So we think, well, I really like that, but I know that it can cause me suffering. So let's give the example of somebody smokes cigarettes, right? So they're like smoke cigarettes, and then suddenly science says, wow, this gives you cancer, we found a link. Now, we can understand that, right? We can understand that it could cause me to have cancer. We hope it won't. We understand that. The problem is that we've become addicted to that, right? We've got this strong addiction to something. So even though we understand that, we're still not able to give it up. And that's because our desire or addiction is still stronger than our belief. And this is the sort of process we go through, on our path. So this individual, Connie, isn't really making a mistake, but they're jumping to a conclusion, right? That they have some profound or some insight into this hollow nature of desire, whereas they've just got a very rudimentary understanding rather than experience or insight. And this is important because you have to keep working at it. And you have to use all of these various different tools: abandonment, transformation, and recognition. Abandonment is to reduce the conditions for giving rise to desire. That is to lessen the effects of our addiction, right? So, for example, somebody who smokes marijuana, there's a very good technique I heard from a psychologist years ago. I used to smoke dope, and I was like stoned for 20 years, right? And I was thinking, this is no good. So it's the same thing, right? This is not good for me. It's not good for my family. I've got to get rid of this. But I had the addiction. There's one thing: you've got your cigarette papers, you've got your gear, as I call it, your tobacco, and then you start making something, right? You start making your joint. Or for somebody who's addicted to heroin, they might like load their syringe and stuff, like, or a spoon, and they melt the stuff down. We all have these different things we go through. It's the same with pornography, right? For some people, then they have this sort of process they go through. They'll sort of think, no, pornography is not good. And then they'll think, oh, go on the computer, right? And so that's this process. So what you do is, in this kind of technique, is like you go through the motions of that, of making a joint, and then you tear it all down, put it aside. And you break the pattern, right? You break this pattern of how you would normally do it. Like the psychologist will say, well, what happens when you get addicted to porn? Well, I sit down on my computer and I'm doing some emails, and then suddenly I think, ooh, there's that website, right? So you're trying to break this habit. This is what abandonment's about. The monks, they will leave their family, and they'll literally get rid of all their possessions, and then they'll just take on some really kind of basic clothing, a begging bowl, a few small items, and then the men and women will be separated, right? So they're kind of dehabituating themselves to their worldly addictions. And then what they do is they start to study the logical arguments of why, contemplate the body. You think, the Buddha's own relative, Nanda, was really, really like girls. He was really attracted to women. And he became a monk because he loved the Buddha, and whatever the Buddha said he would do. So he became a monk, but he didn't have renunciation. Right, so he had to start thinking about it. The Buddha started teaching him about how, beauty is comparative. And what he taught the monks is that you meditate on the body. The body's made, inside the body there's blood, and there's flesh, and there's poo, and there's pus, and all this stuff, right? So this is like this transformative process. But in order for that to work, first you have to get rid of your hardcore addictions. And that means renouncing things. Right? So it's a process. And then once you develop this certainty through looking at the kind of logic explains, well, yeah, I understand that if I don't give up my addiction, then I can get cancer, etc. At the same time as abandoning the causes for giving rise to that, eventually insight starts to arise. And insight is this direct path, right? And it's also, when I talk about direct path, it's also an answer to Clinton's question. It's what is it that we have? If there is no self, it's just an idea we impute upon the aggregates, then what is it? Well, it's this direct thing, what we directly experience, right? Where we cannot deny appearances. That's where we start coming to the view of the Vajrayana. And this view of the Vajrayana is what we call insight or wisdom. But we can't just go to wisdom directly. We can't go to the top of the tallest building in the world directly. We've got to use the elevator. We've got to use different means, right? And this is what it's like. So here I have practiced contemplating on the nature of desire, and I became depressed because things I found joy in appear hollow. Well, this appearing hollow is the first step. Then you have to think, okay, I understand that they're hollow, but I've got to not buy chocolate cake this week. Make it more difficult for myself because I've got to start reversing my addictions. I've meditated to attempt to identify the source of self, and become afraid. We become afraid because we still cling to self, right? Because we don't want to lose me, and that makes us scared. It just shows that we haven't understood no self. But again, it's in this process. So what do I do? What I do is, I don't treat myself to the spa. I don't buy beautiful clothing to adorn the body. And then once I'm reducing my clinging, then I contemplate on the substances of the body. I contemplate on the elements of the body, etc., etc. And in that way, step by step, I go through the Noble Eightfold Path in terms of realizing no self, in terms of realizing the hollow essence of desire. You see, it's a progression. So this is an important first stage. You recognize that fear. I'm afraid. Why am I afraid? I'm afraid because I still believe in a self, and I don't want to lose that. So then I have to come back and think about it again. Though I've made no realize of emptiness, I recognize the independence of my senses and thoughts from any real identifiable or central locus of consciousness. Yes, we understand that, right? We understand that is the case, that there is this sort of psychosomatic agglomeration of forms and mental experiences, and that we impute the idea of a self, but we still have a strong notion of a self. All you have to do is to take a pin, put it near your eye. You don't need to poke your eye, just put it near your eye. We feel uncomfortable. And this is kind of the inherent sense of self we have that we want to protect. So the thing is, you're not doing it wrong. These discomforts, becoming depressed at the notion of desire, the objects of your desire being hollow, becoming afraid of the notion of no self, are indicators that you possess this misconception. And by recognizing that, and also understanding that that clinging itself, clinging to a self, and clinging to essential nature of our objects of desire is what causes us suffering, will give you the impetus and then to have right resolve and right action, right? How to apply yourself. Because I don't want to be depressed anymore because I'm not getting the stuff I like. I don't want to suffer because I cling to self. And so I've got to work at it. So it's an important stage, right? It's not that you're doing something wrong. It's that you're doing something right. But you have to recognize that that's not a fault with the process or the method. That is pointing out your own tendency to mistaken association. Right, we've run out of time. And we only got through 3 questions. But I hope that was kind of helpful for you. And as I said, then tomorrow we have the meditation course. We're going to be meditating on the 9 charnel grounds. But next week I've got to take my dad to the hospital. It's just a MRI, but the doctor just ordered it just to check things out. He's 93, so they've got to check things out from time to time. He's fine. He's okay, no problem. And at the end of the month we have the meditation retreat from May 1st to 7th. So there will be no monthly live stream and there'll be no meditation. But we might try to live stream one of the meditation sessions just to share with everyone. I don't know. We're not sure how the internet is there. It's off-grid, so we're not sure how well it will work. Anyway, if there's been any benefit from our coming together and discussing these issues, then let's dedicate that to the benefit, dedicate that merit to all the sentient beings so they can achieve awakening. And I hope that something I've said will encourage you to apply yourself to your own study, contemplation, meditation, right? We've got to look at what it says. Then we have to make it personal. We have to contemplate it so that we can embody the understanding of that meaning that comes from the Buddha Dharma. And then finally, we have to cultivate it. And that means we have to, in meditation or in focusing on a conviction we have in that truth, is habituate ourselves to that. And on the basis of this, then we will develop experience and realization. So, thank you again for joining us, and until next time, see you later.